Hello everyone. In this lecture, we will continue with the TLS protocol, and more specifically, we will look at some more advanced features of TLS compared to what we saw in the previous lecture. Let's first recap what we learned in the previous lecture. In the previous lecture, we looked at the simplest TLS handshake where the client generates a random pre-master secret, encrypts it with the server's RSA public key extracted from the server certificate, and sends it to the server in the client key exchange message. And we call this type of TLS handshake a server-authenticated TLS handshake because, as you see, in this process, the client authenticates the server based on the server certificate, but the server has no idea who has connected to it. So the client here is anonymous to the server. Now a question to you. How did the client authenticate the server here? How does the client know the server's identity? Right, through the certificate. So the server's identity is specified in the certificate. But at which point here in the handshake does the client gain assurance that the server has access to the corresponding private key? Exactly, after receiving the finished message. When the client receives from the server the finished message and is able to decrypt it, the client gains assurance that this message was received from the party that has access to the corresponding private key. Because to encrypt this message, the server had to have access to the RSA private key to decrypt the pre-master secret contained in the client key exchange message. So here, the server proves its identity by being able to encrypt data using a key that was encrypted with the server's public key. And this is a very common approach of how to establish a secure channel with a party that we also want to authenticate. But anyhow, in this handshake, the client is not authenticated. To solve the problem of an unauthenticated client, the client is usually authenticated on the application level by some shared secret, for example, a password. So here, in this encrypted application data, the client sends its password to the server, and then the server can establish the identity of the client. For instance, to authorize to Facebook, we would send our username and password, and Facebook would let us in. We know that we sent the password to Facebook and not some attacker because our browser authenticates the server using the TLS protocol and the server certificate, right? Now, the problem with using passwords to authenticate clients is that this can go wrong for a bunch of reasons. First, the server can be impersonated. For example, if an attacker can get a fraudulent certificate in the name of Facebook or convince our browser to accept their fake certificate, then at this stage, we will effectively send our password to the attacker, and the attacker will be able to impersonate us in Facebook, right? Another problem is that the server can be compromised. By compromising the server, the attacker can learn the user's plaintext password and then authenticate on behalf of the user anytime in the future. The password hashing helps only if the attacker compromises the database where the hashed passwords are stored, but not if the attacker compromises the part of the system that receives the plaintext password. A related problem is that the password might be reused in other services. So it is very common for people to use the same password across different systems. So if an attacker is able to compromise one of the user's passwords, there is a large probability that the same or a similar password is used by the person to authenticate to other services. Then a slightly old school attack is that the password can be guessed if the password is not strong enough, right? And finally, the password can be phished. The attacker does not even have to obtain a fraudulent certificate in Facebook's name. The attacker may get a legitimate certificate for their own domain that is similar to facebook.com and trick the victim in entering the password there. Or simply make a phone call and ask the user for the password. So there are many different types of phishing attacks that are possible. Now, most of these risks can be avoided by using the TLS feature called Client Certificate Authentication. The idea here is that the client authenticates to the server not using a password, but by using a public key certificate. Basically, this is the process how we can use our ID card to authenticate to some server. Here is how the TLS handshake looks. So there are three additional handshake messages. First, the server sends the certificate request message to inform the client that the client can send their certificate. In case the client has a certificate, the client sends it to the server in a certificate message which has the same structure as the server certificate message. If the client does not have any certificates or does not want to send them to the server, the client must send an empty certificate message. Now, if the client sends its certificate, the client must prove to the server that the client has access to the corresponding private key. This is proven by the certificate verify message, where the client includes a signature made over all previous handshake messages exchanged. So the certificate verify message contains the client's signature over all handshake messages. The server can verify the signature using the public key from the client certificate and gain assurance that the client indeed has access to the corresponding private key. Everything else in the handshake continues as usual. This is how it looks from the user's perspective. After the user clicks on the login button, the user's browser is redirected to a TLS server that performs client certificate authentication. Once the browser receives the certificate request message, a certificate selection window is shown to the user. Here, the user can choose between certificates in case several client certificates are available. This here is my Estonian ID card certificate. After selecting the certificate is sent to the server. And now we have to sign the certificate verify message. We enter pin 1, a cryptographic signature is created, and the certificate verify message is sent to the server. The server verifies the certificate, our signature, extracts our personal data from the certificate, and lets us in. So that's how the client certificate authentication process looks in practice. So here it is crucial for the server to correctly verify the client certificate and the signature. An interesting finding was that several years ago, the two biggest banks in Estonia, SEB Bank and Swedbank, had a bug in their TLS implementation. The signature of the certificate verify message was verified, but it was not verified whether the submitted client certificate has been issued by a trusted CA. So it was possible to create fake certificates and completely bypass the ID card authentication in these services. And at the end of 2020, a few more Estonian e-services were found to have a similar flaw. But okay, is this handshake secure? Can an attacker who has sniffed this handshake take the certificate and signature and use it to authenticate on behalf of the client to some other server or the same server in another handshake? So can the certificate verify message be reused in another handshake? The idea is that the attacker captures the certificate and signature, and that's it. He can now impersonate the client forever. Why does it not work? Well, there are several reasons. The first is that the client's signature is bound to the server's certificate. So the handshake to another server will have a different certificate and the signature check will fail. But can the attacker replay the signature to the same server? The answer is no, because the server hello message of another handshake will have a different server randomness field, and hence the signature will be rejected. So you see why it is important for the server to have unique randomness in each server hello message. If the server had a bad random number generator which produces the same server randomness for all handshakes, then the handshake could be replayed to the same server and the signature will be accepted by the server, and the attacker will be able to replay all the following messages. But the problem here for the attacker is that the attacker doesn't know the pre-master secret, which is here in the client key exchange message. The signature is bound to the particular encrypted pre-master secret, so the attacker will be able to trick the server, but will not be able to send any modified application data here. Another question to you. Do you see why the certificate verify message is after the client exchange message? What if we move the certificate verify message before the client key exchange message? Like this. Now the client key exchange message is sent after the certificate verify message. Can you see the attack which is now possible? Well, by moving the client key exchange message to the end, we will exclude it from the signature contained here, right? But is this a problem? Does the client have to bind their proof of identity to the encrypted pre-master secret? It has to, because otherwise the attack here is pretty straightforward. Let's assume that the attacker is doing a man-in-the-middle attack here. The attacker forwards to the server all the messages up to this point here. After the certificate verify message, the attacker blocks the client and sends to the server the attacker's own client key exchange message with a pre-master secret chosen by the attacker. And that's it. The client has done its part, provided the proof of his identity, and the server will complete the handshake using a key material that is shared between the attacker and server. Afterwards, the attacker will be able to encrypt the crypto application data, but the server will think that it is communicating with the client, which is not good. So you see here that there is a very good reason why messages are ordered exactly as they are. If we change the slightest detail, we may immediately enable some attack. What might be interesting to note is that the security of the TLS protocol has not been proven. Some parts of the handshake have been proven to be secure, but the entire protocol with all the options has not been proven to be provably secure. The problem is that these theoretical security proofs make some simplified assumptions for which it is easier to construct a security proof, but which do not correspond to the implementation that are used in practice. Therefore, actually, we don't have any mathematical proof that TLS is secure, but that hasn't been a stumbling block in relying on it for rather critical transactions. Anyhow, another thing you should notice is that the client certificate message is sent before the change cipherspec message, meaning before the encryption is enabled. So basically, the client's identity contained in the certificate is sent over the network in plaintext. We can use our ID card to perform client certificate authentication, but if we do that, our identity, including our personal identification code, will be sent over in plaintext. This means that some network attacker will be able to see, this person is authenticating to this bank, and so on. Which is a bit sad because this kind of privacy leak is not there when we authenticate on the application level using a password or mobile ID, for example. There is a workaround for sending a client's certificate encrypted, but we will look at it on the next slide. Now, the server certificate is also sent in the plaintext here, but this is not a problem because usually the server certificate does not contain any personal data, just the hostname and maybe the organization that owns the domain. A network attacker can see where the client connects simply by looking at the destination IP address. Therefore, hiding the server certificate would not help much here anyway, right? As you see in this process, the client proves its identity, or more specifically, its access to the private key, by signing and not by decrypting, while the server proves this through the decryption of the pre-master secret. As you see, both approaches can be used to prove the possession of the private key. That is, either by signing some challenge given by the relying party or by decrypting some challenge encrypted by the relying party. And note, when using a signature, the signature must always be bound to some key material that is used to establish a secure connection to the party that we want to authenticate, as you see it here, where the certificate verify message signs the key in the client key exchange message. With the decryption, it is a bit harder because we don't want to disclose the plaintext to parties that could use the plaintext to impersonate us. So we have to prove that we were able to decrypt the ciphertext by, for example, using the plaintext as a symmetrical key and encrypting something to the other party, as it is done in the server-authenticated TLS handshake. So the possession of private key can be proven in both ways. But this is how it is done in this TLS handshake. The client proves access to the private key by signing, while the server proves that it has access to the private key by decrypting. Okay? All right. Now, what is nice about this client certificate authentication is that this type of public key authentication solves most of the problems or security risks of password authentication. The main benefit is that in this process, no secrets are disclosed to the server, meaning that even if the server is impersonated, let's say the attacker tricks the client in accepting a fraudulent certificate here, the attacker cannot reuse the certificate verify message to impersonate the client to the legitimate server. In the case of password, the attacker would get the plaintext password and would be able to immediately use it to authenticate to the legitimate server, but not here. So essentially, the man-in-the-middle attacks will not help the attacker if client certificate authentication is used, which is a very powerful security feature. There is just one but. To benefit from this security feature, the server has to require client certificate authentication for each TLS connection and not only in the login stage. If it is required only in the login process, but afterwards the user is authenticated on application level using some HTTP cookie or some other token, then the man-in-the-middle attack is still applicable. The man-in-the-middle attacker would not interfere with this authentication process, but would man-in-the-middle the connection later, get the cookie, and use it to successfully impersonate the client to the server. A study which was done several years ago found that only a few banks in Estonia required a client certificate authenticated connection for each HTTP request made to the server. So not all servers enforce this strong man-in-the-middle protection in practice. Another benefit of client certificate authentication is that the server does not have to store any secrets. Even if the attacker compromises the server, there is no secret information in the server that can be used to impersonate the client to the server or any other server, as it would be in the case if the password is reused. So the same certificate and public key can be used to authenticate to several servers without introducing a security risk. Password guessing attacks are also irrelevant because in this case the attacker would have to guess the client's private key, which should be improbable. The phishing attacks are also much harder because these would require the private key to be phished out. Even if some attacker would call and try to convince a poor guy to help them, if the private key is inside a smart card, the poor guy cannot give the private key to the attacker even if the guy would honestly want to. An easier attack would then be to simply ask the guy to install some malware on the computer so that the attacker could get control over it. As you see, this authentication method is significantly more secure than using some symmetric secret such as passwords. Unfortunately, this type of authentication method is not too widely used, maybe only in Estonia, where everyone has a certificate and private key in their ID cards. And by the way, note that a similar authentication mechanism is used when using public key authentication to log into some remote server over SSH, for example. Then the TLS protocol has a feature called renegotiation. So in TLS, any party can initiate negotiation of a new TLS session inside the current TLS session. The client can do it by sending the client hello message and the server by sending the hello request handshake message. What is important is that the handshake messages of the new TLS session are protected by the cipher suit negotiated in the previous, or basically the current TLS session. Renegotiation is used by the server to renegotiate a stronger cipher suit or to request a client certificate authentication if, on the application level, a client tries to access some resource that requires such a security measure. In practice, the client-initiated renegotiation is usually disabled on the server because there is no clear purpose for the client to initiate the renegotiation. The client can always close the connection and establish a new TLS session to the server if it wishes to, for example, offer to the server different cipher suits. Now, here is an example of a certificate request on renegotiation where the server would request client certificate authentication by initiating renegotiation over already established TLS session. The TLS session starts by the initial handshake where only the server is authenticated. Nothing new here. However, then, for example, if the client requests access to some server resource which requires the client to be authenticated, the application process, in this case a web server, would tell the TLS layer that before I process the request and return the HTTP response, please get me the identity of the client. The server would respond with the hello request message. The client would send the client hello, but this time the server would ask for the client certificate in the handshake. The server would then authenticate the client and provide an HTTP response to the client, which now has been authenticated. Please note that these handshake messages here are encrypted with the keys negotiated in this handshake process. Okay? So at the end of this renegotiation, a new master secret and new encryption keys will be established. And this finished message will be already encrypted using the keys negotiated here. Another thing is that here in the server hello message, the server may also pick a different cipher suit, a more stronger one than is picked here, for example. But in practice, this session renegotiation is used only to request client certificate authentication. Requesting a client certificate on renegotiation is neat because it enables the use case where most of the resources on the server are public and are served over the server-authenticated TLS to anyone, but only the users who want to log in are then requested to authenticate by providing their client certificate. As you see, this renegotiation also solves the problem of the client certificate privacy, because in a renegotiated session, the client certificate is encrypted here. Again, the sad thing is that the most popular banks in Estonia are not using this approach. When we click on the Login with ID card button, the banks redirect our browsers to another server which on initial handshake requests the client certificate authentication. We can use Wireshark to observe which approach is used, whether our ID card certificate is sent to an e-service in the initial handshake in plaintext or encrypted in the renegotiation, as you see it here in this example. Let's discuss a bit the problem of TLS decryption. More specifically, how to eavesdrop on the TLS traffic from the perspective of a national intelligence agency that is seeking to analyze encrypted traffic that is transmitted over the internet. Some years ago, due to Snowden's revelations, some slides from the NSA internal presentation on attacking the TLS protocol became public. So this is where NSA sees the weakness in TLS. RSA keys stating the obvious. If the key exchange type is RSA, this is the key exchange type we have studied so far. If we can get a hold of the server's RSA private key, we can decrypt the client key exchange message and read the pre-master secret. No other heavy work needs to be done. And this is valid for the life of certificate. I hope this is obvious to you as well. If we get access to the server's private key, we can decrypt the client key exchange message, derive symmetric keys, and decrypt all the data transmitted inside the TLS connection. And note that this is a completely passive attack. NSA does not need to have permanent access to the server. After they get the server's private key, they can passively sniff the network traffic to the server and decrypt all the data. And not only the current data, but all the historical network traffic made in the lifetime of that key. For instance, today they can capture some TLS encrypted traffic, which later becomes interesting to them. Then they will get the server's private key, maybe after a month or a year, but when they do, they will be able to go back and decrypt the data that was sent today. And this is not good at all. And a natural question then is, can we prevent it somehow? Can we somehow smartly redesign the protocol to prevent these passive attacks by someone who has a copy of the server's private key? It is maybe not too obvious, but it turns out that we can. Sure, if an attacker obtains the server's private key, the attacker will be able to impersonate the server. This we cannot prevent. However, what we can do is that we can prevent the attacker from being able to decrypt network traffic collected by passively sniffing the network. We want to make sure that the only way the attacker can decrypt the traffic is by performing an active man-in-the-middle attack, which is much more risky from the attacker's perspective since it can be detected, right? So we can achieve this using a security feature called perfect forward secrecy, or forward secrecy, abbreviated PFS. So how can we achieve this feature? In general, perfect forward secrecy is achieved by using the server's long-term private key to authenticate a short-term or ephemeral asymmetric key that is used to encrypt the actual data. You can see the idea in this illustration. The idea is that for every connection, the server will generate some fresh asymmetric key, which the client must use for encrypt the actual data. The long-term private key will be used only to authenticate the short-term public key, so that the client could be sure that this short-term key comes from the server and not from some attacker. This short-term key should be used only for that particular communication session. The server should destroy it afterwards. As a result, the data in each session will be encrypted with a different asymmetric key, which is destroyed by the server after each session. If an attacker gets a hold of the server's long-term private key, it does not help the attacker to decrypt the traffic, because this long-term key is not used to derive keys which are used for encryption, right? To summarize, the benefits of perfect forward secrecy are: an attacker who has compromised the server's private key cannot decrypt network traffic. The attacker who has compromised the server's private key has to execute active man-in-the-middle impersonation attacks if the attacker wants to eavesdrop on the connection. But as we know, executing active attacks is much harder and there is a risk of detection. And the attacker has to crack X asymmetric keys to decrypt X sessions made to the server. It is not enough just to crack a single private key, the server's long-term private key, to decrypt all the traffic made to the server. So this is also somewhat more expensive in case of cryptanalysis. So by using this perfect forward secrecy feature, we can improve security quite significantly. Now the question is, how do we get this feature into TLS? Well, it turns out that this feature is already in the TLS protocol, but only after Snowden's revelations did the internet community start to promote it being enabled in TLS clients and servers. This idea is used in the TLS cipher suits which use elliptic curve or the simple Diffie-Hellman ephemeral RSA key exchange mechanism. So the cipher suits in this form: TLS, elliptic curve, Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, RSA with some symmetric encryption scheme and some hashing algorithm. So how does it work in TLS? Here is how this key exchange method looks in the TLS handshake. The handshake is a bit more complicated now. There is a new handshake message server key exchange sent by the server, and the content and format of the client key exchange message is a bit different. The server key exchange message contains the Diffie-Hellman group, the server's Diffie-Hellman public key, and the server's RSA signature over the Diffie-Hellman public key, client randomness, and server randomness. So by signing this data, the server proves that this ephemeral Diffie-Hellman public key has been generated by the server and was not substituted by some attacker. Next, the client will also generate a Diffie-Hellman private key and send the corresponding public key to the server in the client key exchange message. So the client key exchange message here contains the client's Diffie-Hellman public key. What is left now is for both parties to calculate the shared secret. So the question is, how is the pre-master secret calculated? Well, I hope you remember how Diffie-Hellman works. The client and server will take the public key of the other party and will raise it to the power of their private key value. And that's it. Now both the client and server have a shared secret, which will be used as a pre-master secret to derive the master secret and the actual encryption keys. Note that this handshake is a bit more complicated computationally because this handshake requires two asymmetric crypto operations: Diffie-Hellman to calculate the shared secret and RSA for signature creation and verification. Usually, the elliptic curve version of the Diffie-Hellman algorithm is used here because it is much faster. So the claim here is that this key exchange method achieves perfect forward secrecy, assuming that the server always uses a different Diffie-Hellman key in the server key exchange message. So even if an attacker had the server's RSA private key, the attacker will not be able to decrypt the TLS traffic because TLS traffic is encrypted not with this RSA key, but with a fresh Diffie-Hellman shared secret negotiated in every TLS session. There were some studies which showed that these ephemeral Diffie-Hellman keys sometimes are not that ephemeral in practice. The study found that some servers are using the same ephemeral Diffie-Hellman key for months. This has security implications because if the Diffie-Hellman key is reused for long periods, then this Diffie-Hellman key would become the target for NSA to decrypt all traffic made to the server, right? Most likely these servers try to improve performance, as generating a fresh key for each session takes an extra effort. What is important to note here is that there is really nothing special about using Diffie-Hellman to achieve the perfect forward secrecy. For example, instead of Diffie-Hellman, we could have used an ephemeral RSA key here. The TLS protocol uses Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange here because Diffie-Hellman, especially elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, is more efficient, faster than RSA. Now, if we sniffed the TLS traffic that our browser makes, we would see that this type of handshake is the most popular today, and not the simple RSA key exchange at which we looked before. This is mostly thanks to Snowden's revelations, which convinced the security community that this perfect word secrecy is an important feature that a cryptographic protocol must provide. An alternative approach to achieve perfect word secrecy is to more frequently change the private key used by the server. If the server's RSA key is frequently rotated and destroyed, then it basically becomes a short-term key. And this is where the browser or CA industry is moving slowly. For example, CA Let's Encrypt is issuing certificates valid only for 90 days, 3 months, and you are supposed to generate a fresh key when applying for a new certificate. Google is pushing to decrease the certificate validity period even further, but currently there is some strong opposition from the certificate authorities. An important feature of the TLS protocol is the TLS extension mechanism. As you should already know, the client hello message can contain length prefixed extensions after the mandatory fields of the message. The server hello message will contain a response to the client's extensions for the extensions that the server supports. Let's take a quick look at some of the most popular extensions. The most popular is probably the server name indication SNI extension. What it does is that it includes the server's hostname in the client hello message. In this example, we can see that the server name indication extension that contains the facebook.com hostname. This extension is helpful to inform the server to which virtual host the client intends to connect, because as you know, one server can host several websites for different domain names. Based on the server name, the server can return in the server certificate message the correct certificate that corresponds to the specified domain name. Without this TLS extension, the server would always need to return a fixed large certificate that would have to contain the list of all domain names hosted on the server. With this extension, it is possible to configure for each domain a separate certificate that would be returned based on the domain name specified in this SNI extension. There are, however, some privacy implications because a network attacker can now see not only to which server the client connects, but also which website the client wants to visit. Then there is the TLS Session Tickets extension. This extension enables session tickets as an alternative to the session resumption mechanism. The idea is that the server can give to the client a session ticket, which can be of an arbitrary size, and the client will have to send it back in the client hello message when it wishes to resume the session. Here's how it works. The client includes an empty session tickets extension to signal that it supports session tickets. In case the server wants to use this mechanism, the server will send the new session ticket handshake message right before the change cipherspec message. This message includes a hint for how long the session data should be valid and the data itself. The data here contains all the information needed to resume the session. When the client wants to resume the session, the client sends this data back to the server in the client's client hello messages session tickets extension, as you see it here. So this session data contains the client certificate, if the client had one, the pre-master secret, and other data. So this data is actually very sensitive. To protect it, this data is encrypted with a symmetric key hard-coded on the server side. The client cannot decrypt this data. Only the server can, because only the server has the key to decrypt it. It is crucial that this data is encrypted securely and that the server rotates this key regularly, as otherwise the perfect forward secrecy feature will be lost, because if an attacker gets a hold of the server's symmetric key used to encrypt these session tickets, the attacker will be able to decrypt all the TLS traffic for which this symmetric key was used. This session tickets feature is useful because here the server does not have to store session information. It is stored on the client side. The server only has to store a single key, single symmetric key, to encrypt and decrypt that data. It is very useful for load balancing. For example, if your website has several different TLS frontend servers, then the load balancers do not have to synchronize the TLS session data. They just have to have the same symmetric key configured. Then there is the certificate status request extension, which enables OCSP stapling. Here is how it works. The client in its client hello message specifies this status request extension to signal that it wants the server to return an OCSP response of the server certificate. If the server supports OCSP stapling, the server will return a certificate status handshake message right after the server certificate message. What it does is that it contains the OCSP response of the server certificate. The client can then verify this OCSP response, and if it is fresh and good, the client can keep contacting the OCSP responder directly. The last extension to mention is the supported elliptic curves extension. This extension simply allows the client to advertise which elliptic curves or groups the client supports. These will be used in case the server selects a cipher suit that uses the elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange method. The selected cipher suit will be specified in the server key exchange message. So as you see, the TLS extension mechanism is a powerful way of how to extend the TLS protocol with new and additional features. Every extension is identified by a 2-byte identifier. If we wish, we can invent our own extension with a unique identifier and describe it in an RFC standard. As the last topic for this lecture, let's have a brief look at the TLS version 1.3. Here is how a standard server-authenticated handshake is performed in TLS 1.3. A handshake begins by a client sending its client hello message and the server responding with its server hello message. Now, what is new here is that client hello and server hello contain Diffie-Hellman ephemeral key shares. What it means is that immediately after exchanging hello messages, both client and server can calculate a shared secret and use it to encrypt all the following handshake messages. And that is what is done. The parties send change cipherspec messages, and all handshake messages that are sent after it are encrypted with the keys derived from the Diffie-Hellman shared secret. So handshake messages after server hello are encrypted. The ephemeral Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange is the only asymmetric key exchange mechanism supported by TLS version 1.3. The RSA key exchange mechanism has been removed from TLS 1.3. This means that TLS version 1.3 provides perfect forward secrecy by default, which is a significant security improvement. In TLS 1.3, the server proves its possession of the private key by including a signature in the certificate verify message. The signature is made by signing all previous handshake messages. If you remember, this is analogous of how client proved its possession of the private key in the previous TLS versions. So the certificate verify message contains server signature over all handshake messages. Now, the performance improvement in TLS version 1.3 is that the TLS handshake is one round trip shorter. This is because the client includes its key share already in the client hello message, which means that after receiving the server hello message, the client can already send encrypted application data to the server. In the previous TLS versions, the handshake process involved one additional round trip. And the last improvement to mention is that session resumption is implemented using session tickets. So after the handshake is completed, the server can send the new session ticket handshake message that contains a ticket that can be used by the client to resume the TLS session. So this is about the server-authenticated TLS handshake. The client certificate authentication feature in TLS version 1.3 has not changed much. The server sends certificate request message, the client sends its certificate in the certificate message, and proves its possession of the corresponding private key by including a signature in the certificate verify message. The good news is that here the client certificate is encrypted. So this certificate message is encrypted with the keys derived from the shared secret negotiated in the client hello and server hello messages. In TLS 1.3, the renegotiation feature has been removed, so we have no renegotiation here. However, TLS 1.3 introduces a post-handshake authentication feature. This means that at any point after the handshake has been completed, the server can request certificate authentication. For example, after the client on the application level requests access to some specific resource, auth in this case, the server can respond with a certificate request handshake message, after what the client will send its certificate verify, and finished messages. So this post-handshake authentication provides a similar feature that could be achieved using the renegotiation feature. However, the problem in practice is that this post-handshake authentication feature is not supported by browsers. Chrome simply doesn't support it, while in Firefox it has to be enabled manually, which means that it is not usable in practice. And therefore, servers which want to support TLS version 1.3 have to request client certificate in the initial handshake, regardless of whether the client wishes to access some public or private resource, which is not nice. But alright, these are the main differences in TLS version 1.3, which I wanted to share with you. With this, we finished the lecture, and to remind you, the instructions for the homework were given at the end of the previous lecture. So good luck with the homework, if not done already, and see you in the next lecture.